It's not at all unusual to hear the Pentagon being criticized for its bloat, bureaucracy, and spending binges. But what is surprising about the latest criticism is that it doesn't come from an outsider with an anti-military agenda. It comes from the Secretary of Defense himself. Robert Gates has an impressive resume with more than 30 years of government service, and he's just announced he's retiring next month. At the Pentagon, the Defense Secretary is called SecDef. The title he might prefer is the Soldier Secretary, because he says his top priority is the men and women in uniform, a priority, he says, that's often neglected by the Pentagon bureaucracy. But first, we wanted to learn more about the Special Forces raid that killed Osama bin Laden and what was going through the Secretary's mind as he watched it unfold with the President in the White House Situation Room.
The story will continue in a moment.
It was a perfect fusion of intelligence collection, intelligence analysis, and military operations.
Having said that, you were a nervous wreck.
Yes.
What were you thinking as you watched this unfold in the Situation Room with all those other people like the President and Vice President and Secretary of State?
Well, I think like the rest, I was just transfixed, and of course, my heart went to my mouth when the helicopter landed in the courtyard, because I knew that wasn't part of the plan, but these guys were just amazing.
After the mission, Secretary Gates went to meet personally with the SEAL team.
I joked with them a little bit. I said, you guys have spent the last several days being debriefed. Would you like to debrief me on what happened in Washington while we were all watching you all? And we had some good laughs over that, but obviously an amazing group of people.
You are the ultimate soldier secretary, and I can't imagine the pride you must have felt meeting these young men.
It was awesome.
But while he had confidence in the SEALs before the mission, Gates told us he was very nervous about the intel.
I was very concerned, frankly. I had real reservations about the intelligence. My worry was the level of uncertainty about whether bin Laden was even in the compound. Well, there wasn't any direct evidence that he was there. It was all circumstantial. But it was the best information that we had since probably 2001.
And did you feel you had to strike while the iron was hot, if you will?
I think everybody agreed that we needed to act and act pretty promptly.
Especially, Gates says, President Obama, the 8th Commander-in-Chief he has served.
I've worked for a lot of these guys, and this is one of the most courageous calls, decisions, that I think I've ever seen a president make. For all of the concerns that I've just been talking about, the uncertainty of the intelligence, the consequences of it going bad, the risk to the lives of the Americans involved, it was a very gutsy call.
You could see it in his face in that photograph. What was it like being near him in that room?
Let's just say there wasn't a lot of conversation by anybody in the room.
Secretary Gates says the death of bin Laden, seen here in his compound before the assault, could end up being a, quote, game changer in the war in Afghanistan, partly because the al-Qaeda leader won't be around to obstruct a possible deal with the Taliban.
If we keep the military pressure on and continue to hold what we seized over the last year and expand the security envelope, a change in the relationship between al-Qaeda and the Taliban could, in fact, this fall or winter, create the circumstances where a reconciliation process could go forward.
What would you say to the majority of Americans who say, now we've got bin Laden, now it's time for the troops to come home?
I would say that we are getting the upper hand. We have, over the last 18 months, put in place, for the first time, the resources necessary to ensure that this threat does not rebuild, does not reemerge once we're gone. I think we could be in a position by the end of this year where we have turned the corner in Afghanistan.
And more troops could come home?
And more troops could come home.
You don't see the troop withdrawal, though, being accelerated this summer because of bin Laden's death?
I think it's premature. I think we just don't know. It's only been a week. and people are already drawing historical conclusions. I think that's a little quick.
In his own history of more than 30 years of government service, Robert Gates has developed a reputation of being diplomatic but direct in his relationships with both foreign leaders and presidents. We talked about that on a flight from Riyadh to Baghdad inside the Silver Bullet, Gates's airborne office, an Airstream trailer strapped to the floor of one of his military planes, a C-17.
Welcome to the Bullet.
We asked about the meeting he had just had in Saudi Arabia with King Abdullah.
I don't pull any punches, and neither does he. And it goes back to the very first time I ever met him. And I said, you know, I'm an old CIA guy. I'm not a diplomat. So I'm just going to tell you what I think. And you tell me what you think. And maybe that's a better way to go forward.
Did he like that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Robert Gates started in the CIA as an analyst in the 60s, and he worked his way up the intelligence ladder in the Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and Carter administrations. He has spent years studying highly classified and frequently disturbing information.
What scares you the most? What worries you?
I think I and most of us would say it would be a terrorist with a weapon of mass destruction.
In this country or anywhere in the world?
Well, anywhere, but especially in this country.
How likely is that?
For years, we've received intelligence that they're trying to acquire a weapon of mass destruction. So far, they've been singularly unsuccessful, as far as we know. But it is the one thing that could be a huge challenge.
Mr. Gates, do you believe that we are currently winning in Iraq?
No, sir.
Robert Gates surprised the Senate when he said that after President George W. Bush nominated him to be Defense Secretary. But 5 years later, as we talked at the U.S. military headquarters in Baghdad, across from one of Saddam Hussein's old palaces, Secretary Gates told us the U.S. military surge, the much debated and criticized deployment of 30,000 additional troops to Iraq, turned the situation around.
I think had we left here with our tail between our legs and with chaos, it would have been very bad for our Army and for our military.
But Gates warns it could all fall apart after the scheduled American withdrawal at the end of the year. And as he took one of his last helicopter rides over Baghdad, he urged the U.S. Congress to fund State Department programs in Iraq after the U.S. military leaves.
My worry is that we'll be penny wise and pound foolish, that we will have spent hundreds of billions, maybe $1 trillion here, over 4,000 lives, 30,000 wounded. We're on the 2-yard line, and I'd hate to see us not get across the goal line. And it's the State Department that's going to take us across the goal line.
After the Bush presidency, President Obama asked Robert Gates to stay on to manage the war in Afghanistan. He became the first defense secretary to serve under presidents from both parties.
Is this the hardest job you've ever had?
Absolutely. We have been at war in 2 places. Every single day I've been Secretary of Defense. And I've been Secretary of Defense longer than World War II lasted, longer than the Civil War lasted. So it's been tough.
When you look back on these 2 major wars that you have had the responsibility to oversee, what sticks in your craw? What do you regret?
I think the hardest thing for me to deal with is leading a department that is organized to plan for war, but not to fight a war. And so everything that I've wanted to do to try and help the men and women in the field, I've had to do outside the normal Pentagon bureaucracy, and I have had to be directly involved on a week-to-week basis to make sure that it got done. That's been very frustrating.
Case in point, the Humvees that roadside bombs turned into death traps for U.S. troops. In Iraq, they were eventually replaced by life-saving $1 million armored vehicles called MRAPs.
My attitude was, if you're in a war and kids' lives are at stake, you're all in. You do whatever is necessary to protect them. and help them accomplish their mission. And if you got this stuff left over at the end, then so be it.
You also
have left over a lot of living kids.
Gates eventually spent $40 billion to buy new MRAPs, vehicles he says ended up preventing thousands of American deaths and injuries. He also battled the Pentagon bureaucracy over what's called the golden hour, the time it takes to get a wounded soldier from the battlefield to a hospital.
The medical bureaucrats told me that in Afghanistan, 2 hours was okay. And I said, I beg your pardon? Actually, I didn't say that, but...
Something a little stronger?
Something a little stronger. I said, you know, if I'm a soldier and I've been shot, I want to have the same expectation that I did when I was deployed in Iraq, that I'm going to get picked up in an hour. So now the average rescue time in Afghanistan is about 40 minutes.
Robert Gates has used the same tell-it-like-it-is style in his office at the Pentagon, where he works flanked by portraits of his two favorite no-nonsense generals, Dwight Eisenhower and George C. Marshall.
You've ruffled a few feathers here at the Pentagon during your tenure.
Well, I've ruffled a few feathers at all the institutions I've led, but I think that's part of leadership. One of my favorite little sayings is to avoid criticism, say nothing, do nothing, be nothing.
He's canceled tens of billions of dollars worth of expensive weapons programs and infuriated the Air Force when he stopped production of its cherished F-22 Raptor.
There was a lot of fat here at the Pentagon, in your estimation.
I think it is self-evident in the respect that the budget of the Pentagon almost doubled during the last decade, but our capabilities didn't particularly expand. A lot of that money went into infrastructure and overhead, and frankly, I think a culture that had an open checkbook. And so that's what we had to change.
The secretary also says the Pentagon is stuck in a 20th century time warp, just like the aging 747 he flew to and from the Middle East. It can be refueled in midair and has a shield to protect its electronics from a nuclear attack, a product of Cold War thinking, just like Pentagon war planning, according to Gates. He went to West Point this year and said it's time to change.
In my opinion, any future defense secretary who advises the president to again send a big American land army into Asia or into the Middle East or Africa should have his head examined, as General MacArthur so delicately put it. Things go wrong, and things don't develop as you anticipate, and young men and women die. And so I think, I wrote in my book a long time ago that the dirty little secret in Washington was that the biggest doves wore uniforms, that those who were the most skeptical of military action were the military. And now I understand better what I wrote, because I feel the same way. I'm much more cautious now because I see the consequences. And I also see the unpredictability. This brigade lost 100 soldiers during the surge.
Gates keeps a daily tally of the men and women who have died in Iraq and Afghanistan, and on every trip always makes time to visit with the troops.
My highest priority in the nearly 4.5 years I've had this job is to get you what you need to complete your mission and come home safely. Thank you. I've said kind of all along that I think of them as my own sons and daughters.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thanks for your service. It's because I send them. I'm the guy that signs the piece of paper that sends them here. I'm the guy that signs the condolence letters. I'm the guy that visits them in the hospitals. And it just, it's very emotional for me. They are the best.
What do you say in those letters? What can you say?
I swore I would never let any of them become a statistic for me, so with each condolence letter that I write, I get a packet of hometown news accounts of that individual as well as a picture. And I get to read what their coaches and their parents and their brothers and their sisters say about them. So I feel like I know them. In some ways, it makes the job harder, but I want the parents or the wives or spouses to know that I care about every single one of them.
We'll have more of our interview with Secretary Gates tomorrow on the CBS Evening News.